Hello, everyone, and welcome to the OCNJ Local, your podcast for everything happening here in America's greatest family resort. We're your hosts, Dominick Dougherty and Drew Fasy.
We are your local guys.
Drew, on social media, we were recently referred to as Ocean City guys. No, local guys. Local
is that right?
Yeah, not natives, locals. Just remember that. Not natives, locals.
That's right.
Drew, man, first winter set in here on the island, that's for sure. Got our first snowfall of 2025, or the winter 2024, 2025. Good times, lots going on, and looks like it's sticking around because temperatures are staying, below normal here for a while. Not many people going to the beach.
It's cold out there, and the wind makes it just bitter. Right.
Dude, how are you walking your dog in this? Well, your dog, if anyone's ever seen Drew's dog, it has like a built-in fur coat, like an unbelievable fur coat. My kids say she's the fluffiest dog on the planet.
She's actually got two coats.
You put a coat on that dog?
No. Naturally, she has.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say you put two coats on that dog,
and she'll sit out in 19-degree weather, laying in the snow, and you can't get her in. So you just have to dress for it to take her for walks. And I do 10,000 steps a day with her.
Good for you.
It never ends.
Good for you.
Yeah.
But
speaking of weather, Dom, so I'm going to start with a shout out. So snow started at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning and lasted for 12 hours. We got 5, 6 plus inches of snow.
I saw
which
7.
We're not used to here on the Barrier Island.
I saw 7.5.
Oh, is that right? 7.5?
That's what I saw. 7.5.
So I want to give a shout out to the City of Ocean City, the Public Works guys. They were out for hours and hours and hours, still at it, cleaning up all the roads and alleys. You have to remember the alleys, right? Because for every mile of road, there's a mile of alleys.
Yeah.
And, I think these guys do a great job, and they're out in pretty snotty conditions. So I want to give a shout out to the Public Works Department.
Shout out to the county as well, too. I don't think a lot of people know there's a couple roads that are maintained by the county here. And they were out right away. Bay Avenue is one of them. I live on it, truck out there going crazy, plowing away. So shout out to them as well, too. I got one shout out too on a somber note here. Shout out to the Kasmark family. Alex Kasmark, great entrepreneur, big part of Ocean City. Took a rundown movie theater and turned it into what is today the Surf Mall. Recently passed away. So shout out to Chris, Bill, and Wes and their family. Our thoughts and prayers are with them in this time.
Absolutely, condolences to the Kasmark family.
And well, Drew, on a lighter note here, when you're freezing and it's cold, we got to say, to warm us up, 143 days till Memorial Day.
Is that the countdown begins, Dom? I love it, love it.
143 days till Memorial Day.
I can do that standing on my head.
Just to get you feeling those toes in the sand again, at least sand with no snow on it. But I also use that too as my clever segue into our guest today. See that? Look at that. Little magic there.
I see what you did there.
Joining us today is Christian Barth. I got to say, get it right. Christian Barth, author of The Garden State Parkway Murders, a book that he extensively researched for over 10 years about the Memorial Day murders that took place in 1969, of Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry. This is still an unsolved case. It's one of the biggest cold cases in New Jersey still to this day. I grew up in this area. I never heard about it. Now, what about you, Drew? I mean, this is like, you were probably what, like 20, 25 at the time of this?
As I mentioned, I was a very, very young boy at the time. I was in Ocean City that summer. It was a summer that Neil Armstrong
You're a
landed on the
suspect.
moon.
You are definitely a suspect.
And I do remember it because I have 3 older sisters, and I know my parents, especially my mother, was very worried at the time.
Yeah.
But all the connections, I mean, the girls were staying in Ocean City at the time of their murder, and lots of connections to town. So it's a good OCNJ local story.
Yeah. It definitely is that. I didn't hear about it until some former teammates, posted something on social media, and it's been like, whoa, this is crazy. This happened here. All the connections, the bigger pictures. Chris really dives into his research and what he's done, the interviews that he's had, the people that he's talked to. And, it's crazy because, talking to him offline a little bit, he's still got to be pretty close-lipped about things because it is an open case. It is an ongoing investigation.
Right.
So
the book is fantastic. Highly recommend people to read the book.
Yeah, it's
really well written and really super interesting.
He also mentions another piece that he wrote, like a fiction-based one, and he said, that's how he kind of delved into writing the more factual-based book because he spent some time. The Origins of Infamy. Both of those are available at Sunrose and Amazon. But still, man, this is wild. Like,
yeah,
if you've never heard about this, if you have any interest in this kind of stuff, we're not a murder podcast, but today we are. It's crazy. Some of the things he reveals to us, especially some of the things about potentially solving it and what seems to be holding it back from this. So stick around. Chris is going to join us for a bit of a lengthy interview. It's definitely worth it, though. It'll keep you on the edge of your seat as he just kind of delves into the case, the suspects, the girls, everything surrounding
Ted Bundy.
Just wild, absolutely wild. The connections that are here to this small little resort town and this cold case. So I'm at a loss for words right now. I don't know how to transition any further. I shot my shot.
We'll be right back with our guest, Christian Barth.
Christian Bale. That ironically, he plays a serial killer in American Psycho.
Ted
there
Bundy,
you go.
Right?
There you go. Look at you. Look at you.
No, he played the.
He played an American Psycho.
He played the Zodiac Killer.
I don't think that was Zodiac Killer. I think that was just a movie, American Psycho.
All right, so let's stick with author Christian Barth.
Yeah, see,
we'll be
this is why I do the transitions here, people, not him, because he just butchers them. Anyway, it's a great interview. It really is. Drew and I we're super excited to do this all week. And Christian does not disappoint with his level of insight and knowledge about the case. And fingers crossed we can eventually find some peace for these families and these victims. So stick around. Christian's gonna deliver the goods. We'll be right back. All right, everyone, welcome back. Joining us on the podcast today is our very special guest, Christian Barth. Did I say it right?
Mm-hmm.
Author of the Garden State Parkway murders, documenting the still existing cold case of the murders of, I just want to get this right here, of Elizabeth Perry and Susan Davis in Memorial Day weekend of 1969. Christian, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you both for having me. I'm honored.
Well, truth be told, we are not a cold case murder format podcast. We're just about Ocean City. I've grown up in the area, and I didn't know anything about it until a couple weeks ago when some former teammates of mine posted on social media about the Oxygen documentary Killers on Tape featuring Ted Bundy, which you're featured in. And since then, I've devoured your book. It's an awesome book. So thank you for taking the time to write it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I have, I'll date myself, but I didn't grow up in Ocean City. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, but we had a home here and we would come down every summer. And in fact, I remember that specific summer because in July of 1969, I was in our home on Battersea Road watching the man walk on the moon for the first time. So I remember that summer specifically, and I also remember my mother, especially, being very concerned after this incident.
Right.
Yeah. So Christian, how did you get involved with this cold case? What drew you to the Davis Perry murders?
A long time ago, my parents used to have a house in Avalon, and I remember the Philadelphia Inquirer arrived one Memorial Day weekend, and the byline on one of the sections said, 69 Parkway murders unsolved. Bundy is maybe to blame. So I read it, and it indicated that serial killer Ted Bundy, who was executed in 1989, had intimated prior to his death, while he was on death row, his involvement in the murders of Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry. He made some very cryptic references without admitting it outright, speaking in the third person. He made these to two different authorities. He said it to a psychologist on death row in 1986, a guy named Art Norman, and he also said it to Dorothy Lewis, who was a famous psychologist. And two separate instances, he indicated that he was involved in these murders. So that fascinated me. And then I obviously began my law career and digressed into becoming a writer instead, part-time. And I was looking for a topic for a short story. I was taking a summer writing class at Rutgers University, made a short story about the case. And then I decided to write a fictionalized version of it, which I published, titled The Origins of Infamy. And I gathered so much information during this deep dive that I decided I might as well write the nonfiction book. In fact, it was a writer down there in Ocean City, Bill Kelly, a local writer who was also fascinated with the case, who encouraged me to write that. So back at around 2010, I just started regathering information and mercifully interviewing a lot of the detectives who were then living. Guys like Jack Kreps, George Dix, who have since passed away, but they were more than generous in sharing what information they had about the case. So that's how I became interested in it. I'm just fascinated by it. My parents actually met at a place called Maynard's, which is now the Crab Trap. So there's sort of these strange Homerian parallels, the circle and the meeting there, and then the girls disappearing 200 yards from the place where my parents met. So if it weren't for the Summers Point traffic circle, I wouldn't be here right now. So that sort of intrigued me. And I've always been intrigued by those cases from the 60s and the 70s, the cold cases. And of course, the Ted Bundy angle sort of just really made it even more interesting to me.
In your book, there are a lot of references that you just mentioned, the Summers Point Circle. There's a lot of bars and restaurants and things that you referenced that I really enjoyed. But my question for you is, Christian, how long did you spend digging into this and interviewing people before you actually published the book?
About 9-10 years. I mean, if you wanted to stretch it
Wow.
back farther, depending on where you start, it'd be about 2001 where I started to get interested in it. And that's, again, when it took me about 6 or 7 years to write The Origins of Infamy. And then that was more a product of my own imagination while using real life instances and trying to create, from Ted Bundy's viewpoint, what might have happened. And, went to Times Square, New York Public Library, all those places. And then the actual research into interviewing people, that took place in 2000 and about 2009, 2010. Right after I published The Origins of Infamy, I decided to work on the Garden State Parkway murders. So it was about 10 years of research. And of course, I work, as an attorney as well, and I'm a father. So that would also add to the fact that it took so long to write. I had to make a living and do all these other things. But there wasn't a day that went by that I didn't think about it. There's not a day that goes by today I don't think about it, even though, the book was Garden State Parkway Murders, came out about 3 or 4 years ago.
You mentioned the Origins of Infamy. Is that available in print or
Yeah, that's
online?
available on Amazon, and I think still sold at Sunrose.
Okay.
Down in Asbury.
I'll
Nancy
have to check
Miller,
that.
Ross Shiflin, delightful people. Very supportive, very, very supportive.
They are great people, and they're really a mainstay on Asbury Avenue.
Yeah.
I heard a vicious rumor from my neighbor that potentially that bookstore might close.
It's not closing. Yeah, from what I read, I think it's repurposing and
repurposing. Okay.
Yeah, they're not closing. That is a rumor. Right. They've sold the building.
Okay, that makes sense now.
They are going to stay in the building in a smaller space.
Okay, perfect, good. Because I was sad to hear that, because they do have, the bookshop. There are not many of those left in the world today. But I will definitely go down and buy a copy of that this week, because I was thinking to myself too, like, why hasn't this been made into like a movie of some kind or something like that? Because it has all of the hallmarks of a great movie, with the connections to so much happening at that time and bigger things that happened, after it. It's a wild,
all the connections that you reference, and locally, the two girls didn't live in Ocean City. They were staying in Ocean City at the time of their death, right? And the last place that they were seen alive was the Summers Point Diner, and they spent time on the boardwalk. They spent time on the 9th Street beach. But then, as you say, broader than that, you have all the other connections, the Ted Bundy and what was really, we were talking about this, Christian, right before the show, was I can't remember the name of or location of the jail cell.
Colorado Springs.
Colorado Springs. It's actually Glenwood. I think it's Glenwood, Colorado Springs, and I believe it's still there. The old jailhouse in Glenwood Springs, which is, I guess, 45 miles outside of Aspen.
So Ted Bundy escaped from that county jail, right?
Yes.
And who was the other guy that was in the same jail?
So Ted escaped from the jail. This was his second escape. First one was from a courthouse. He escaped from the jail, and then through a light fixture, this tiny jail cell, and then went on, sadly, to murder 4 girls down at Florida State in 1978. I think it was New Year's Day. Prior to that, in 1969, Ronnie Walden, a drifter from Georgia, had also been jailed in the very same cell that Ted Bundy escaped from. And New Jersey State Police came up to interview him, question him actually, regarding his involvement in the murders of Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry, because he was living in Atlantic City at the time, working on the boardwalk down there, and did leave shortly thereafter. So the coincidences are just unbelievable. They actually were alerted to Ronnie Walden because of a woman who I'd interviewed in the book at great length, who was convinced that he did it because she had interactions with him several months prior to the murders of Susan Elizabeth down in spring break in Fort Lauderdale when she met him.
Yeah, and when I was listening to the book and you went through that interview with this woman, I can't remember her name, but her testimony was like, that was no doubt. And then it talked about how he got jammed up with the motorcycle and paying his boss for the motorcycle. And then those tracks were actually found near the murder site.
Yeah. There's all sorts of, speculation, some of it founded, some unfounded. I spoke with not only the one witness, but a second witness, who, when you're researching a book that this old, you rely on so many things. And I remember just looking at Google Maps one day, that sort of broad terrain type view. And then they narrowed in and they show residences that were behind the parkway at the time. So I literally found the names of the people who lived there and just started randomly calling. And I think the second person I called said, yeah, she's no longer with us, Marjorie Garwood. And I said, do you remember anything about that? She said, do I remember it? She's like, I dated a guy who was a suspect, took me on his motorcycle, and I'm like, oh my Lord, it's Ronnie Walton. And she sort of had the same, creepy feeling about him, as did, the first person that I'd spoken with, the one who was told by the state police that they had found half of Ronnie's fingerprint on Susan's car. And other persons have told me, authorities, that there were motorcycle tracks found, I guess, in the dirt or in the sand along mile marker 31.9. So that would be the connection to Ronnie. Ronnie did steal a car when he left Atlantic City right after the murders, and was seen wearing the watch, a dive watch that was found near Susan Elizabeth. They were the only piece of evidence they ever did find. And that's what prompted the first person, I'll call her Kathy, to say and tell police, look, I saw this guy, and I saw him later. I met him in spring break. He came up to Atlantic City. He had a knife in his car. He was very just hair trigger temper. And he was wearing a watch. And she went into the Atlantic County, and I'm going to say probably the New Jersey State Police had the old barracks in Hamilton. And she went in there and they said, well, if we show you a picture of this watch, can you identify it? And she said, absolutely, that's it. And she knew it because it said 17 jewels on it, which is, I guess, a reference to fathoms, how deep a dive watch can go. And they connected it with Ronnie Walton. So, but, Ronnie was given a lie detector test and passed the test. But, Ted Bundy was given multiple lie detector tests and passed them all as well. So the detectives that I've spoken with said you can't be 100% reliant on lie detector tests because sociopaths have a way of beating them.
Yeah, and Ronnie Walton, from the information you provide in your book, he was charismatic. He was an athlete. He was a good-looking guy. He kind of fits the description of what people described when they saw individuals there. Or around the scene. And he was definitely a sociopath, maybe not so much violent. I mean, ultimately he did end up, with the murder charges in jail. He was a huge fraudster though. He was able to, from reading your book, if you want to elaborate a little bit more, I mean, you did far more research like on Ronnie Walton, because to me, I was like, this guy did it. And then you get into these other suspects. I'm like, well, they did it too. Like, were these guys all there at the same time, like doing this? Like, what was going on here? It's like
Ronnie, he was. I tell he was from Cairo, Georgia, and I interviewed syrup makers, and I went and interviewed people in Cairo, Georgia, that knew him. It's so interesting. A small town like that. I literally called up. And when I first started my investigation of Ronnie down there locally where he grew up, then there was like a switchboard operator. And I said, there was this guy who lived there. And she's like, what's the last name? I said, Walton. I know someone. I know a Walton. So she put me in touch with someone, and who then put me in touch with his ex-girlfriend. And he was one of those guys where he was always a bit of a grifter, a con artist. Some people saw it, some people didn't. A good athlete, not a great athlete. I interviewed a Hall of Fame All-Pro tackle who since passed away. He was in the Dolphins, who was a teammate of him. And he said Ronnie was good, just not good enough to get that Division I scholarship, and they didn't have the money to send him. So he wound up getting some sort of grant to go to Florida State, and he had a child, I think, through a girlfriend who died, but it was a stillbirth. And his ex-girlfriend from high school said that's what set him over the edge. And from that point, he joined the Army or the Air Force, and then he went AWOL, and then he started his career of thievery. So you could get away with that back then.
Yeah.
There were a lot of these guys around. They showed up in Wildwood, Ocean City, all of these towns where young college girls were, because there were no cameras. There was just no way to really get a thumbprint on them. And they would just, metaphorically speaking, because they could just do whatever they want and just slide in and out of circles, and no one could really identify them. But they would steal, they would con people. I talk in the book about how he, would take advantage of the good graces of people in the Midwest, even in Colorado, realtors, whatever he could do. He'd ask to borrow a car. He'd, I'm going to take this car for a test drive. He'd steal it. He'd ask to look at a house. And then stay in the house and then steal whatever was in there. And then his crimes grew increasingly more, violent as he grew older. And he wound up going to jail ultimately for shooting a realtor in the head down in South Carolina, and then being put in jail. And then, of course, he wound up killing himself in jail during this process of a hostage standoff.
Yeah.
He was tormented, and on top of which he was a schizophrenic. So that certainly, didn't help his cause.
And then, you have some other suspects too that are, we'll talk with suspects first, not people who commit. You have Mark Thomas.
Mark was one of those fascinating characters,
there was a lot of things in the book.
Yeah, for years I never, and this is going way back, the newspapers had always referred to him as an 18-year-old hippie from Norristown. So for years I didn't know who he was. I couldn't get the information from the state police because it's still an open investigation. So I was in Temple University, ironically, where Ted Bundy was, and went to school for a time. And I was at their archives, and I looked. They have the case there in the archives, and I looked, and I Xeroxed what they had, and kept this sort of compendium for a long time. And I'd always review it. And then there was this one piece of paper that said, "For PIX of suspects released on a lack of evidence, see." It said Thomas, Mark W.M. And because it was such a common name, I thought nothing of it. And then one day I was at my law firm's office, and I decided to Google this name. And I saw, the Klan references, and I looked up, the age of this person. He had been arrested, and it was him. And then I just started doing a deep dive into his past. The story was Mark was 18, and he was mouthing off in Philadelphia at a clothing store. To two girls, and they're saying that he was down in Ocean City and he knew the girls that got murdered, and the shopkeeper overheard him, called the Philadelphia Police Department. Of course, the homicide department quick paid him a visit and took him to the Roundhouse, which is the nickname of their headquarters, and grilled him all night. And during the night, the New Jersey State Police came in and assisted, and they had him all night. And according to George Dix, who has since passed away, he said, I had this guy a hair's breadth away from a confession, but he never did it. I've always had major questions regarding Mark's involvement in it. Half the people think he did it, and half the people don't. Because after this happened, he went on to become head of the Pennsylvania KKK and national chaplain for the KKK, and then he veered off into other fringe right-wing movements like the Arrogant Republican Army. Ultimately, he was arrested for conspiracy to commit bank robbery. There were these group of people in the Midwest these men who would rob these banks in the 90s and then funnel their proceeds to him. And he wound up getting caught and arrested for that. And even prior to that, he was really actively seeking publicity. He'd go on Maury Povich, Geraldo, with the hoods and all that stuff. And to me, the biggest problem I'd have with Mark Thomas, and the biggest doubt I would have about his guilt in something like this, is not only the specifics of the crime, but the fact that if a person did this when they were 18 years old, and they were a person of interest, the primary person of interest to the police never lost interest in him, sort of shadowed his movements. Would a person like that, with Mark's intelligence level, although he's an 8th grade dropout, is extremely bright man, would he then go on and actively court publicity with, that in his past? And I don't think he would. I've always suspected that Mark may know something and knows more than he's telling, but that's the situation with Mark Thomas. They ultimately released him after all the hours of questioning, even though he gave quote unquote fuzzy answers to a lie detector test. They really kept their focus on him. And of course, after him came Ronnie Walden, and then there were the other guys like Gerald Stano and Ted Bundy, who would serve as suspects later on.
Now, it's funny you say he might know. You talk about Mark might know more than he let on, and you mentioned Gerald Stano. They actually went to school together for some time or around that time.
Yeah, they went to elementary school together when they were kids, and they did know one another. I have confirmed that. The question of whether they're friends or not, we just don't know. But according to police reports, they did know one another. They grew up a mile away from one another in Center Square, Pennsylvania. I guess it was a suburb of Norristown, or a neighborhood of Norristown, Bluebell, I should say. Bluebell. And I interviewed, again, one of these random deep dives into the area, and contacted the police department out there. And I said, Whitpain Township Police Department. And I talked to a gentleman. I said, you have any know the names of any older detectives? And they said, yeah. So I called the guy. I'm like, do you remember Mark Thomas and Gerald Stano? He's like, oh yeah, they were friends. I said, oh, wow, that's unbelievable. That's just too coincidental to be true. And they grew up about a mile from one another. And, Gerald, of course, I don't know if you want to jump to him, but Gerald, of course, knew or intimated. He signed a confession to his alleged involvement in the Parkway murders when he was in jail in Daytona Beach, subsequent to the murder of 30 women, give or take, down in Florida. And he signed a confession to a detective named Paul Crow, saying that he had done it. I read transcript of the conversation between Chief of Police Crow and Gerald. And he definitely, the context of it definitely showed that he had some fear when this question arose. But the, I guess, participating detective, for some twist of fate, just seemed to veer off that line of questioning regarding the girls. And go into another line. But he ultimately signed a confession. But the facts of the confession were a little different than the actual crime. So New Jersey State Police sent 2 detectives down there to interview him. And they left thinking he didn't have anything to do with it.
Backing up to Mark Thomas for a minute. So the 2 girls were last seen at the Point Diner and left and got on the Parkway, and it's less than a mile from that entrance where their car was found, and ultimately they were found murdered in the woods, right? There was an eyewitness who said that that the girls picked up a hitchhiker wearing a yellow shirt, and you report that when Mark Thomas was in that shop in Philadelphia talking about the murders, he was wearing a yellow shirt. Right.
And that's so ironic, because the testimony, for lack of a better term, it wasn't under oath, but I guess you call it the testimony of a guy named Albert Hickey, who was a part-time photographer and a security guard at the Summers Point Diner, turned out to be discredited. Albert was, I guess, prone to stretch the truth at times. And
So is Dom.
I'm sorry?
I said, so is Dom.
Yeah. Yeah. So he said that he was down there and, it was at 4:30 in the morning, just getting off his shift. He was having a cup of coffee and he saw a light blue convertible pull up near the Jolly Roger restaurant back then, directly adjacent to the diner. And he said that he saw the car pull up and a guy get in the car, was wearing a yellow shirt. And then he wound up leaving. And again, the detectives that I spoke with who sort of shrugged and rolled their eyes, although that's Albert. And ironically, it was the yellow shirt that wound up implicating Mark Thomas, because you're right, he was wearing a yellow shirt when he was in the bookstore. It was called Tendler's Bookstore, and I since found the name of that subsequent to the publication of the Garden State Parkway murders. Al Tendler was the shopkeeper, and that was the name of the store where Mark was. They didn't list that in the paper.
And
so
now,
get going, making that connection back to Ocean City real quick. So back in those days, along Bay Avenue in Summers Point, you had Bay Shores, you had Tony Mart's, you had the Anchorage, and then down along Port Boulevard, you had Dunes Till Dawn. And those bars were, Anchorage, you'd start with the 7-for-1 beers, and then you'd go dance at Tony Mart or Bay Shores. And I didn't know this until I read your book, Christian, that the band, who I'm a big fan of, the band were the house band at Bay Shores, was it right? Tony
They
Mart.
they were actually called Levon and the Hawks. Levon Helm and the Hawks. There was prior to they didn't change the band. But yeah, they were the house band out in '64, I believe. And the story is that they were playing one night, and I guess at some point Bob Dylan called over to Tony Mart's and talked to them and said, do you all want to, be the opening act for my tour? And they said yes, and they subsequently left their gig as the house band for Tony Mart's this summer '64, and the rest is history. I'm a big fan of the band as well, by the way. Absolutely love them.
Well, the reason I brought this up is in those days, all the kids who were at the shore, for the summers would leave Ocean City and they'd hit the bars, and after the bars, they would go to the Point Diner, which was open 24 hours. And that's why you mentioned Albert Hickey being a security guard. Today, you'd wonder, well, what the heck did the Point Diner need a security guard for, right? Well, that's why, 2 o'clock to 7 o'clock in the morning, and all these drunk college kids going to eat, right?
Yes, it was. I talked to a gentleman who owned the restaurant. His name's escaping me right now. And he said it was 24/7. The diner did an unbelievable business in the summertime. You're right, because the bars let out at, I believe, 2 a.m., except for from Dunes Till Dawn that let out at 6. And they would all just trample over in various states across the circle to the diner and eat. And there were just a ton of people there. There was a line at 5:30 in the morning. So sort of harkens back to what I mentioned earlier about, people like Ted Bundy, Ronnie Walden, all these people were just, so able to just infiltrate themselves into that and just sort of get lost within the mix of people that subsequent to the disappearance of Susan and Elizabeth, very, very difficult for people, waitresses, whatever, to identify, anyone who had been there.
Yeah, I was surprised in the book when you talked about the culture of Ocean City in the summer of 1969. If you look at it today, you would not think that you would have, drifters sleeping under the boardwalk, people coming and partying
Hotel
all night long.
Underwood. Remember I mentioned that before, the Hotel Underwood.
Yeah, you would not think that at all of Ocean City in its current state. Um, so that was really eye-opening. And like you said, it makes it much more sensible that these kind of shady drifters can just assimilate themselves into the crowd. They would stick out like a sore thumb at the Anchorage these days.
Yeah, but back then, again, the time period when this happened was sort of between the Summer of Love was officially 1967, and it was followed by the Manson murders of '69 and the Parkway murders, which just preceded them. Those were watershed moments where the innocence was quickly lost. You had the Altamont, I think it was, riots out with the Rolling Stones, drugs, LSD. Was considered just sort of a harmless experimental drug until the Manson murders that got all the publicity. And then everyone was really, really on guard after that. And then you had the sexual revolution in the 70s. So all these factors combined into it. Ocean City, the police department pretty much allowed the kids to do what they want within certain boundaries. I interviewed at length a guy named Bill Pentland, interesting guy. He was a art gallery owner in Ocean City who has since passed away. And he had been there for years, very hippie, avant-garde hippie, interesting guys, bohemian, tall, garrulous man. And he told me it was just fascinating to see what was going on behind the scenes, with all their olive oil parties. A lot of Twister, a lot of crazy things went on behind the scenes, due to, of course, the confluence, I think, of these staid older ladies and society types that were in Ocean City and the Gardens and areas like that. That's
where Drew lives.
I know. And with the hippies coming in, so all these factors, and again, without cameras or cell phones. And with the drugs and the drinking, sort of provided just a very fertile ground for whoever did this to operate with a certain degree of anonymity.
Now, I was young at the time, but as you say, Dom, that's not the Ocean City that I knew. It was a playground of beach and bay and families, and even though I have older brothers and sisters, I don't really, I have no recollection of any hippies or.
Oh, you said you were what, 7? Like you're not
7.
getting into an olive oil twister party, Drew, at 7.
No, but even seeing
I
like,
hope not.
the hippies, like. I just don't relate that to Ocean City of my youth, but obviously it was there, right?
Well, ask your sisters what they think. They'll probably relate more to it, being that 17 age, right around the age of, Susan and Elizabeth here. We've been talking a lot about the suspects so far. What kind of research did you do into the victims and their families? Because in the book you mentioned that I think one of them was very outgoing and, constantly like socializing, whereas the other one was a little bit more reserved, but perhaps reserved socially, but definitely more open for exploration, if you will.
Well, I think they're both very, very sheltered girls from affluent families. They were no different than any other girls at the time. They were very, as I said, they were proper. They like to have fun, and I think their parents allowed them to do that. I mean, Elizabeth's parents from Minnesota allowed her to spend the weekend. It was monitored. They stayed at one of the rooming houses, which they don't have any longer. $9 a night, and they were very naive. Both, and as I said, people like those two, from very well-to-do families, very naive and trusting. Maybe picked up a hitchhiker, or they did pick up hitchhikers prior to that, but it was done very innocently. And I think they just didn't have any idea and we didn't learn this till later when we began to study serial killers and sociopaths, that they would pick up someone like this, especially in a dry town like Ocean City. So they were both very lovely young women, very, very innocent, who just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah. Wow.
So I have a specific question, Christian.
Okay.
So again, the girls left the Point Diner. They got on the Parkway, headed north. They were found. Their vehicle was first found on the Parkway, mile marker 31.8. Is that right?
Between 31.8 and 31.9.
Okay. Then the vehicle was found, the bodies were found, some items were found. But at some point later on, their car keys were found. So this was on the east side of the Parkway, correct? You're headed north.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's correct.
And the keys to the car were found roughly 2 miles up the road in the woods. They were found by Girl Scouts, I believe, just randomly.
Right.
How do you put that together? I'm having a hard time putting that together.
Well, originally, due to the locale, the newspapers, the police surmised that it had to be a hitchhiker. Of course, they listened to what Albert Hickey had to say. They just automatically thought it was a hitchhiker. They picked up the circle who pulled him over and then killed him. However, a week or so after the murders, a group of Girl Scouts were out picking flowers. And it may have been, it's actually, in the book, it was 2 miles. It may actually have been 4 miles. If you all drive north on the Parkway, there's an overpass that I believe is right before 38A, or the exit for 38A for the expressway. And that's where they were found. So I always, and the police as well suspected that, if this were a hitchhiker wouldn't be pulled over or pull them over, murder them, and then proceed to hitchhike again and just drop the keys off on the side of the road where they could be found. So that suggests to me that, it was a car that pulled these girls over, 1 or 2 people, and through whatever ruse they used to pull them over. It could have been by force. It could have been by, what Ted Bundy would always say, a broken leg or what have you. Then they murdered them, and that he or they murdered them and then left. And I suspect a few miles later threw the keys off the side of the road, because again, what hitchhiker would walk and do that? It just doesn't make any sense. Right. So the getaway car, whoever was in there at the time, threw the keys to the side of the road is what happened.
Which led me back to Ted Bundy and his VW bug.
Well, no, Ted didn't have the bug in 69. I think it was 73 where he came.
Oh, okay.
He was a 66 Volkswagen. He didn't get that until 73. But, I spoke with Ted's aunt, and she said, oh, well, he wasn't down there that weekend. He was playing basketball with the cousin in the backyard in Lafayette Hill, Pennsylvania. So, as far as that's concerned, I don't think Ted would have been driving a car in those circumstances. But if you look at what he, Ted's remarks were so incredibly cryptic and coincidental that they just can't be discounted. And he's still officially considered a person of interest by the New Jersey State Police, and I can confirm that. To what he said, he said, he spoke in the third person. And he said, well, it was 1969. School had just ended. He wound up going down to the beach, wound up meeting a couple of girls, and it was the first time that he did it. He was shocked by what he had done. And that's when Art Norman first said, wait a second, 1969, end of the school year, everything just coincided with the murders of Susan and Elizabeth. He made it similar. And then when the night before he died, when he was talking to Dorothy Lewis, he said, well, I was in Ocean City. I walked along the boardwalk, and he said, well, I attempted to abduct a woman and then she got away. So he admitted to being in Ocean City. So he sort of clarified his remarks as time went on, but he, discounted any, admissions at that time. But I mean, if you're going to die the night before, you're not going to go and admit certain things, I would think, not only because you think there might be a 1 in a million chance at a stay, but as I said, he's just not only that, but he wouldn't want to give the satisfaction to law enforcement agencies at that time because there was no impetus for him to do so. So,
yeah, he was always playing those mind games, right, with psychologists and law enforcement.
Yeah, and he had actually, during my interview, which I referenced specifically in the book, in the Garden State Parkway murders, his aunt said that her grandfather or father had a house in Ocean City on 26th Street, near, I guess, Princess Grace, and that they had spent, a lot of time down there, as had he. And to the extent that serial killers will often, mark out their grounds, they have to familiarize themselves and be comfortable with their grounds before they use those to kill and dispose of bodies. It would lend itself to the fact that Ted, in fact, had been down there. He didn't just come up with a random city. He had, in fact, been there. And I was actually the first to uncover the fact that there was some lineage there in Ocean City, on top of which he admitted that he was on the boardwalk, stalking women at the time, which could be corroborated that he was at Temple University and in the area.
And you had interviewed several women, women now, girls at the time, who recognized him and called him creepy, right?
Yeah, there were two. I mean, I got all sorts of interesting calls after the publication of books. I saw Ted. I was with Ted, but no one has a photograph. There were actually three that I could think they were very credible. One woman said that she was down there. I think it was in Sea Isle. It's on the beach, a guy wearing a cast, which, purporting to be injured, which of course mimicked Ted's MO. Went ahead and he was wearing a beard, tried to get her to come to his car. And she already got the creeps from him and decided this wasn't a good idea. There was another gentleman who was an artist at the time, and he was at the Summers Point hospital the early morning, several hours before the murders. And he was working as some sort of capacity, doing intakes, and he spoke with a person, and he immediately, the guy was suspect. He went and wanted a cast removed. He said, "That's strange in the middle of the night. Why do you want a cast removed?" And he said, "Let me see some ID." And he said he did hand him a card, and then when he went back to call, I guess, the parents, which was what they did back then, he came back and the guy was talking to a guy named Gifford, Detective Gifford, with the Summers Point Police Department, and the two wound up leaving. And the second, in 1989, he saw on TV that there was a Bundy connection to these murders, and Bundy was making the admissions. He immediately called the Atlanta County Prosecutor's Office and spoke with Detective Bruce DeShields and explained in detail what he saw. He said, "Look, I'm an artist. I'm a graphic artist. I know faces, and this was Ted Bundy who I saw." But again, absent any photographs, I gather there was nothing really they could do about that.
So, Christian, there are connections to, all of these famous serial killers. You've interviewed detectives and witnesses and all these people. What, in your opinion, do you think happened that night?
That's a great question. It's a terrific question. So what I've done is I've sort of narrowed it to a bunch of scenarios, which I think happened. And the first thing you have to recognize, certainly contributes to one theory or another, is that these murders took place at, let's say, 6 a.m. Okay. So at 6 a.m, Memorial Day, it's May 30th. You look at Farmer's Almanac, whatever. You see sunrise was at 5:29. So it was bright out when these happened. We don't even, because it's so dark and cold and knows the time on the East Coast, you just automatically associate that time of the day with it being dark. It wasn't, it was light out. The bars, the one bar that had let out, there are other overnight bars, I think, in Egg Harbor Township. Drew might know those because he was active in the 50s and the 40s and all that stuff. So there was the Dunes from Dawn was the most, which Drew mentioned earlier. That was the most famous one out on Longport Boulevard. That let out at about, I think, 6. So one of the theories I have is that whoever did this, obviously, and it seems almost axiomatic, was drunk and out of his mind. There were a lot of Vietnam veterans that were coming back troubled during that time. There was a lot of drug use. So you combine those factors. Whoever did this was not only, again, it seems obvious and redundant to say that they weren't in the right mind, but I don't think a serial killer or whoever it was planned this much in advance as much as they or he or they came across the right set of circumstances. They may have been incels. They may have been back from Vietnam, 2 guys, whoever it was, driving, and a set of circumstances just developed that they took advantage of, and the murders being precipitated by their state of mind, which you can say Ronnie may have been out all night. He was in the area. He was a schizophrenic. So you take a person who already is unbalanced and add alcohol and add them waking, being up all night. Whoever did this was up all night. They didn't just wake up and decide to do this after a cup of coffee. They were up all night drinking, doing drugs. And I think those factors really lent it to it. So I think whoever did it was, I don't know, there's a lot of people who have, mental issues and drinking issues, but I think you just have to consider that when you're looking at people in locations where whoever did this might have been prior to it happening. Now, I know the police interviewed people at the Dunes and all those different places, but I suspect whoever did it was either at one of the bars who had been they may have, in the last part of my book, I describe an interview I had with a woman named Barbara Solemn, who's actually a writer. Roan writes about the Pine Barrens, terrific woman, and she retells a story to me in great detail that in 1970, she was in Summers Point and was at the diner, and she remembers looking in that cage, the dispenser, that the bulletin and all the newspapers came in and saw a picture of Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry. She had just been out in Wildwood at the Shamrock drinking all night, and was decided to go home to Longport, and she stopped for something to eat, and she drove home. She said a guy had been following her previous to that, and she remembered him in Wildwood, and then was driving along, and he tried to push her over to the side of the road, and it was right around the area where Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry were murdered, and drove along. The guy pulled way, way far ahead of them, and she saw him jumping, like doing jumping jack on the side of the road, trying to get her to pull over. And she didn't. She drove past him. She said, look, I was an orphan. I had street sense. I wasn't going to do that. Now you think Susan Elizabeth may have been, more apt to say, oh my God, this guy's, Ted Bundy or whomever is over. Let's pull over the side road and help him. So, I think the time of the day and where this happened, sort of these factors lend itself to the fact that whoever did it, a person or persons, pulled them over through whatever ruse they did in the car, murdered them, and then took off in the car.
Wow. Now, because you do mention in the book there were 2 cars at the scene other than the blue convertible. There was a tan Mustang that had 3 boys in it, and there was a black Pontiac that was mentioned. And
right.
It's odd because there was a patrolman who did their loop out of the Avalon, the state police officer that did his patrolman, and he only mentioned the blue car. He didn't really mention the tan car or the black car. Right. Where did they come into play? How did they all of a sudden fit into all this? Yeah. Especially with your
1 second. Actually, I have to go below my nose. I'm just coming over.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Take your time. Yeah, this is wild, Drew. This is wild because that's an interesting theory, and I'm going to wait to talk to it more for when Christian comes back because, me just thinking here, what if there's someone that the police aren't even looking at? that's
That
involved
third
in all this.
that third car, I know.
Yeah, like
That's a big question mark for me as well.
There's a good chance that there's someone out there who may or may not have since passed away that did this, and they're just chilling, like with it on their conscience, or lack thereof. So no, we were just saying, Christian, with all your research and input and everything you've done, like, and when you mentioned these two cars, the tan Mustang had 3 boys in it. They all passed lie detector tests. They all came in right away and gave testimony. But then you have this black Pontiac. Do you feel or what do you think are the chances that there's somebody involved in this that no one is looking at?
It could be. It could be. With regards to the cars, what happened was these 3 boys from Folsom, Pennsylvania, were driving north and been partying in Wildwood all night. If you read the newspaper accounts, they said, well, they were tired and ran out of gas and pulled over to sleep. I guess you were allowed to do that back then, and the police didn't bother you. So 4:30 in the morning, they pull over. Now, I talked to George Dix, the detective who spent so much time. He said, no, they weren't tired. They were drunk. So they pulled over. 3 of them went to sleep for about an hour. And they tell police, they wake up. And this was right before at 31-9. They wake up, and I want to get this correct for you both. They woke up and saw the girl's car there. And when they pulled over, it wasn't there. And there was no one in the girl's car. They had run out of gas, so they went and hitchhiked, got gas can at an Esso station, Weiss Esso station, near what was in the Shore Mall, got a ride back to the car, put the gas in, and left. And they said nothing happened during that time, nor, and this is what I find completely fascinating, nor did they hear why they were asleep for the hour, any screams, anything emanating from the woods, and these girls would have been killed about 50 yards from where they were. So how does someone, whoever did this, and this lends itself to what I said earlier about this person not being in the right state of mind, why would a person pull over Susan and Elizabeth in front of a car where there were 3 boys sleeping, murder them, and then leave, setting themselves up for there being possible eyewitnesses? Unless they were so out of their mind on drugs, drunk, or a serial killer so, predisposed and locked in to that frame of mind that he was going to kill these girls. There was also a black 59 Pontiac that was seen in front of the girl's car that they were never able to find out who that was. And just one newspaper article around the time, the superintendent of the state police surmised that whoever did it was in that car. So you have the boys' car, they pull over, they fall asleep. Witnesses saw not only that car, but Susan's car and the black Pontiac ahead of them. So the black Pontiac leaves during this time, assuming that's the person who pulled over Susan Elizabeth. Why does this person do this in front of another car that's already parked, assuming he saw that there were 3 boys in it? To me, it's absolutely unbelievable how that went down.
I agree. That is just completely baffling, especially on the parkway where you have miles and miles.
Yeah. And adding to it, we didn't delve into the, how these girls were found. I mean, Susan was found nude, face down, 219 feet off the side, between 31.8 and 31.9. Stab wounds, beaten. Elizabeth was found 19 feet away from her and had a bra tied into her hair. So it wasn't used to restrain her. Seemed almost ornamental. Now, again, it goes back to what serial killers, often they'll tend to dress up a victim, as far as leaving their signature on the crime scene. So what's always fascinating is this person who does this, again, this goes back to, it could have been a serial killer. Why does a person after murdering him, why isn't getting away immediately their number one priority? They kill them and then take the time to basically dress the victim while it's sunny out, 200 feet away from the parkway, not very busy, quiet parkway. Why does this person do that? Imagine that the confidence of this person just doing that. And when there was another car there, so not only does he murder them in broad daylight, but daylight, takes time to dress the victims, and then takes all this within 50 yards of people sleeping.
Confidence, but an insane confidence.
Yes, complete depravity. Again, it just fascinates me, just the mindset, whoever did this. And again, that the drinking, drugs, there had to have been that involved. There's no one. And I spoke with a serial killer expert down in Florida, and he said to me, I gave him the set of circumstances. He said, there's no way a serial killer could have done this because his main fear is getting caught. That's why they work at night, take him to these distant areas where they do this it just didn't seem to him that they would do something like that. However, how do you explain the fact that, the bodies were dressed, as they were? It's almost like a signature serial killers. And Elizabeth's underwear were missing. So you could always make the argument that was, a memento of sorts, that they took from the crime scene with them.
Wow.
And there was no sexual assault either. And oftentimes serial killers and these sadist killers, it's the murder that sort of substitutes for the more traditional sexual gratification, the close-up killing, and then that's how they derive their satisfaction, not from the more traditional means.
And I think it's even more significant if both bodies were fully clothed, then that would be one scenario, but one nude and no sexual assault is really, really interesting.
Right. And it causes you to start to, the way they were found, what happened was, I suspect that, again, whoever did this, when they pulled the girls over through, again, whatever means, we weren't there, took, Susan's pocketbook, her purse, I should say, was a straw purse, was found in the car by Lewis Sturr, the first trooper who came to the scene and found the abandoned vehicle. So Elizabeth's purse was found at the crime scene. So why is her purse found there, and why is Susan's left in her car? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Right.
But it lends itself to the scenario that that there was in fact a ruse used to get one of the girls to go in there first. I think it was probably Elizabeth, through whatever pretense this person used. I have a friend in there. There's an emergency. Come into the woods with me. Okay. And then Susan thereafter saying, well, let me go check on my friend. Everything seems to be okay. I'll just, leave my purse here. So if they were both in at the same time, I would think they would both have their purses with them. And why would, unless she had kept it on, this being Elizabeth, at the diner, why was her purse found by the crime scene, and why was Susan's purse found in her car when it was left abandoned?
Just another one of so many questions and oddities about this case.
Yeah.
So I guess, I got one final question. Do you feel that with all your research and all the puzzle pieces and moving parts here, do you feel there will ever be closure in this? Do you feel that we'll ever figure out who really committed these crimes?
Well, I think eventually, I'm going to say something that I normally wouldn't say. I don't think I've said before, but I'll say the interests of, I've spoken with myriad retired detectives who both worked on this case and other cases. And I said to them, back in, as an aside, back in January last year, I brought suit on the Superior Court of Atlantic County under OPRA, Open Public Records Act to get access to the files. You have to have a balancing test, and was denied by the judge. And I still can't figure out why, because every Oprah legal expert I talked to said there's absolutely no way that you'll be denied access to these files, given how old it is. Until persons like myself, civilians with a great interest and just a wealth of knowledge of these cases, are granted access to limited, supervised, whatever, these cases, they'll remain to be unsolved. The way the law is set up, nobody outside of law enforcement is allowed to see them. So until that loosens up, I don't know that there'll be closure. If at some point, the prosecutor's office allows people to view files, again, in a supervised scenario, I think that'll probably solve a lot more cases. But until that happens, the chances of it happening seem to lessen with every year. There are obviously more and more DNA advances, and authorities are constantly testing these cases to see what happened. But everyone thinks, because they watch the TV shows, and you notice these TV shows always come together in a certain way. There's always the DNA hit, and there was 99.9% of the time there was sexual assault, and they had the evidence, and they just didn't test it till years later through a backlog or whatever. But in this instance, there wasn't a conventional sexual assault. So evidence back then was stored in plastic bags, clear plastic bags, which contributed to its deterioration. Evidence like that from human fluids, blood, whatever, is evanescent. It denigrates over time. So each year that goes by, it becomes more and more difficult, especially in cases like this. So it isn't as easy as everyone thinks it is. If a person wasn't traditionally sexually assaulted and there were no bodily fluids left, the odds of that happening or getting solved are slimmer and slimmer.
Interesting. So do you feel there's a smoking gun back there potentially?
No, the smoking gun, I think, in the preface to my book, in the Garden State Parkway Murders, I quoted, forgetting his name right now, one of the persons who was the Kings County Sheriff's Department out in Washington, who worked extensively on the Bundy case. And he said what he drew from that case, he was the person who was, when the girls started disappearing out in Washington, he was initially one of the guys that was tracked down Bundy. And he said the biggest lesson he learned from that was with these cold cases, he said 90% of the time, it winds up being one of the first three people they interview.
Wow.
So I believe that, whoever did this is most likely, in the files. But I understand that, the prosecutor's office, police, they have to prioritize cases. So, cases this old, they certainly, it's at the top of their list. I know that much as far as, a cold cases and getting things solved. But I just don't think they have the evidence now. And the DNA technology, as much as it's advancing, it's just not up to date or, to find anything. And they haven't found anything thus far.
Wow. Well, Christian, we really appreciate your time today.
Very much so.
I could sit here and talk to you for another hour, at least,
Sure.
with all the interesting facts you have. Why don't you let everybody know where they can grab a copy of the Garden State Parkway Murders? And what was the name of the first one?
So both the Origins of Infamy and the Garden State
Origins of
Parkway
Infamy.
Murders, you could buy at Sunrose Music on Asbury Avenue, and you can also get it on Amazon.
Awesome. Yes, I know that Garden State Parkway Murders is available on Audible for those of you that like to, listen.
Well, let's
it's a great
shop local and go to Sunrose.
Yeah, it's a great listen.
Yeah.
But if you are in the area, you are in town, stop by Sunrose and pick up a good read for the beach this summer on these cold days.
For sure. Really good read, Christian.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed it.
Well, Christian, again, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Fingers crossed we can have you back on soon with some sort of turn of events here in the case, somebody finding something or, you getting access to those files and being able to, pinpoint who is behind this.
Thank you both. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been the OCNJ Local, your podcast for everything happening here in America's greatest family resort. Peace out, everybody.